Today I'm talking with Dave Ladd, president of RDL and Associates. He's an ag policy expert. Dave, it's the end of 2015. We've got plenty to talk about. Let's start with Cuba. The U.S. has decided to ease the relations with them and maybe increase trading with Cuba in the next year. What does that mean for Minnesota producers?
Well, that issue of the United States and Cuba relations is one that's kind of personal to me. As you may know, I was able to spend some time in Cuba a few years ago before this thaw occurred, probably 6 years ago. And they did restore diplomatic relations in July of 2015, which, as we all know, had been severed in 1961 during the Cold War. And now there is diplomatic representation in Cuba with embassies open in Havana and a similar Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. But we do have a continued commercial, economic, financial embargo, which in many ways makes it illegal for U.S. corporations to do business in Cuba. My reading of it, a number of years ago when I was there was that there was opportunity there, and there's great opportunity, but there's also been, of course, generations of an embargo and a number of other issues. So I think opportunity is there. I think we just had a trade mission return from Minnesota with Commissioner Frederickson and a number of ag interests, soybean, wheat, dairy, corn, barley, and they also see that same potential, but it's going to take time. It's not going to happen right now. It may not happen in the next, year or two, but it will be slow and incremental. And of course, having embassies open now and moving towards more what we'd call, quote, normalized, unquote, relations does provide opportunities here for Minnesota and American agriculture.
That is very true. I know, like you said, Commissioner Frederickson was down there, and it seems like Minnesota producers seem to be very receptive to the idea of entering the Cuban market. Is the U.S. government or the USDA also receptive to that kind of idea and letting the states start trading with the island nation just to our south?
Well, the question is not that is the U.S. government, parts of the U.S. government may be, but remember, to lift the embargo, it'll take congressional action to end the embargo. And, of course, we know that that is part of the government. I think the administration clearly, obviously is open to that and moving in that direction. Minnesota agriculture interests are as well. They have been, as we know, for a very long time. And then that issue is how does the politics play out, especially in 2016, for ending the embargo. That I would not see happening in Congress, certainly this coming year in 2016, and we'll see what happens after that. But yes, of course, there is interest in that market and those opportunities just right off our coast.
Oh, and you mentioned congressional policies. Let's talk about one that sort of got to have the fun of the full year this year was the Agricultural Act of 2014, also known as the Farm Bill. How is the U.S. USDA new programs, whether it be like ARC or PLC, been handling for producers this year?
Well, I think you'd have to ask producers, but you're correct. That's one thing I was going to mention is Farm Bill implementation. We talk so much about some of these other issues that have not only happened in 2015, but will spill over into 2016 and perhaps beyond. But, the new farm program, the safety net programs, they were put into action this past year. And it's my understanding the Farm Service Agency issued, $3.9 billion in farm payments, which are, of course, different than the direct payments that had been under previous farm programs. And obviously that was one of the selling points, or, reallocating that $5 billion a year from direct payments into safety net programs, crop insurance, those sorts of risk management tools. And so, farmers, like anything, it was a little more complicated, or they had to make those business decisions, and they spent their time evaluating it. and looking through and deciding what was best for their operation, which I know kind of was also based not only on commodity but by geography, whether you were a cotton farmer in the South or a corn or soybean farmer up here in Minnesota. You obviously had to weigh those two programs and decide which was best for you. But yes, that's one thing we kind of forget sometimes. But that's where the rubber hits the road, is the implementation of the Farm Bill and how that has rolled out. And in a lot of ways, it's never has without its challenges. But to be honest, the fact that we have to be reminded of it means it's probably going about as smoothly as it can. There's always bumps. There's always something that comes up in the road, and of course, when it gets down to all politics, all farm programs are local. What that means for each operation. But those decisions were made, and I know there was a number of tools out there, online and web tools for producers to help make that decision that they utilized, and we've seen that now that the FSA has rolled out farm payments and will move forward. So,
well, and you mentioned
actually a positive sign.
Right, and you also mentioned a complicated year, and that was definitely one for Minnesota's poultry producers, whether they be chicken or for turkey, especially with the avian influenza that hit the state in early 2015 and actually affected us probably all the way into June. How did that impact either policymakers or producers?
Well, I think we saw that in both the state and the federal level, and overall, I think there were nearly 220 sites and 50 million birds that died or were destroyed. And as we know, as ground zero here in Minnesota, we led the nation with more than 100 detections statewide. And I think it was in the range of 310 million in losses, of business losses alone. That's not to mention the psychological impact on our turkey and chicken growers. But one thing I do want to mention, that was a topic of conversation and taken very seriously. And in all the years I've been around agriculture, I tend not to use the word crisis very lightly. That was something, I don't think, a form of disaster earlier this year that we had seen and the industry had seen. It was a totally different type. And to the credit of the Minnesota legislature, Democrats, Republicans, the House, the Senate, the administration, the Department of Agriculture, Department of Health, they all did work together very well, including Chair Hamilton and Chair Sparks in the Senate and Chair Hamilton in the House, to ensure that we had that issue addressed. Now, it did have some bumps, and it did, get tied up in end of session maneuvering. But in the end, I think the process worked, and there was a good faith effort to work together. And then, of course, the industry has stepped up. They, of course, knew that once they passed through that storm, that this fall they potentially would face another resurgence, but that luckily and fortunately didn't happen. But they didn't sit back and wait. I know they've been working very hard as well to stave off and be able to respond, and they learned a lot. The industry and the poultry sector learned a lot from this last spring, and at the federal level too. Obviously, they stepped up. So it's one of those issues where it had a very devastating impact, but it was survived, and hopefully going forward we can have positive outcomes on that front.
Well, and I know there was some accolades poured on to a local poultry grower, the GNP company up here in central Minnesota. I know some producers down in North Carolina or the Southeast were actually looking at how GNP handled that situation and how they were not impacted by the virus. So that is kind of one of the bright spots in this dark cloud of the avian influenza, that we were able to put policies in place and actually keep it from entering certain facilities, and hopefully those will be used in the future. Another thing, Dave, I want to talk about is the waters of the United States. I know that issue is still being held up in court. That was a very contentious issue this year for producers and lawmakers alike. What did you see during 2015 in regards to WOTUS?
Well, I've kind of started lumping waters of the U.S., WOTUS, and that ongoing saga with what we had here in Minnesota in the legislative session as well, with buffer strip initiative by the governor, and of course that's ongoing. But I've started to just lump those into water quality issues. Obviously the implementation of the EPA WOTUS rule has been stalled. As we recall, a North Dakota court was the first to issue a stay for 13 states, and that followed for a similar ruling for 30 other states. So we have it in the court system. We have the legislative branch involved here, of course. We have the judicial branch, and we have the executive branch. It comes out of the executive branch. The courts continue to issue the stay, and it doesn't. We don't know how long that will last, that stay. And the administration has not given any sign that they are going to back down on this issue. In fact, in a recent blog post on the EPA website, they have an agency acting administrator for public affairs has defended EPA's work on the WOTUS rule, and she stated that EPA won't back down from its mission. I don't think anyone's expecting them to back down necessarily from their mission, but whether you have court rulings, findings, the legislative branch, legislation being proposed, is that what process did they follow? And in fact, was the process they followed in finding supportive comments for this rule, was it legal? And those are fair questions to ask. So given the number of states engaged in litigation, I think there's 31 right now, there's going to be a continued cost to taxpayers in terms of litigation expense, and as well as an ongoing litigation for, let's say, 5, potentially 6 years, millions of dollars that the agriculture sector and others are going to have to expend to defeat the regulation. And so I think what we're going to see, again, is it did not get included in this omnibus package that was recently passed. It obviously had been one of those where we had called big 3 items, along with GMO labeling and country of origin labeling, that I had been kind of watching as policy riders. But it's an issue that I think is going to see congressional action further in 2016. Again, there was unsuccessful attempts in Congress to cut the spending piece for implementation of the rule, but that doesn't mean it's going away. So we're going to have to watch on 3 fronts: judicial, the courts, the administration, and how hard they push. Remember, this is the administration's last year in office, and I think this is just going to be an example of how hard they continue to push and challenge these court rulings on regulatory issues such as WOTUS. We're going to see more of that, I think, in 2016. 2015 might have just been the prelude.
Well, and you mentioned the 2 issues that I think are going to be very big in 2016, and that is the GMO labeling and the country of origin labeling. What did we see in 2015 with those issues, and what can we maybe expect in 2016 legislatively or in the courts?
Well, I think the country of origin labeling, issue it was one of those that was addressed to large degree in the omnibus package. As we remember, the mandatory country of origin labeling provisions were initially included in the 2002 Farm Bill, and they were revised in the 2008 and 2014 Farm Bills. But that law went before the World Trade Organization 4 times, and of course, Canada and Mexico had been asking for retaliation. They did not believe that cool provisions met WTO obligations. And this past year, of course, we had the decision that they could levy approximately $1 billion in annual retaliation against U.S. products. But I think with the passage of the full repeal of the beef and pork provisions, that may, again, stave off and address a number of the concerns. So it's yet to be seen what does pop up in 2016, but that was a hot issue, not just in 2015, but in previous years, that we may actually be able to put now off to the side and kind of have it on the radar and monitor it. But the heavier action in 2016 is going to be some of these other issues. We talked about WOTUS, and then, of course, GMO labeling, which has been ongoing. a voluntary standard for GMO labeling rather than a mandatory standard or a state-by-state patchwork approach. And what happened on GMO labeling is again, that was one of the big three I was watching during omnibus consideration. And they just ran into a lot of opposition, particularly Senate Democrats. Remember, the House has passed legislation in 2015 dealing with GMO labeling and having a voluntary standard. Again, trying to address, we talk a lot about Vermont, which is set to go into effect in July of 2016. Of course, there's court cases surrounding that as well that are ongoing. But there's also a couple bigger prizes out there, and that's Connecticut and New York State, that those that are looking for a mandatory federal labeling requirement or a mandatory requirement are going to be targeting. And so what had happened is the proponents of a voluntary standard had been hoping to put in a temporary stay, temporary to hold off and work on being able to come up with a uniform label, but that fell by the wayside again in the negotiations, closing negotiations of the omnibus package, and therefore they have readjusted back to comprehensive legislation, and that will pick up again here in January. We've had both Senate and House leadership, and Senator Stabenow and Senator Roberts and others indicate this is something they want to deal with early on here in 2016, and we'll just see what pressure points present themselves in January, February for legislation to move.
And what are some other issues, Dave, in 2016, maybe at the Minnesota state level, that you're looking forward to or keeping an eye on for the upcoming year?
Well, it'll be a short session, so I think here in Minnesota it's going to be, if we have a surplus, what do we do with it? And so that I think is, it's going to be more of a funding or fiscal. Obviously, decisions will have to be made. At the federal level, we'll see what happens with trade, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As we know, Trade Promotion Authority was passed and signed into law, which had been the first time since 2007 that we had what we used to call Fast Track Authority, but Trade Promotion Authority. And then, therefore, we're able now to look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That obviously is going to be controversial. And it's expected that there will be a vote on it in 2016, but the question is when in 2016. 2016, since it is controversial and there's a lot of synergy on both sides of this issue, whether or not the deal is passed, it's going to put all incumbents in the races, congressional races, on record of either supporting or opposing trade policy. And so for that reason, the vote in Congress, it might be delayed until after the 2016 elections. But it could be one of those issues that could become an election focal point for candidates. But that is something that we'll have to watch for 2016, is not only what type of adjustments, coalitions develop and how it progresses, but also the timing of the vote in Congress.
And one final question, Dave. I know they were talking about putting a high-speed rail line between Rochester and Minneapolis. Is that something that producers should keep their eyes on in 2016 if they decide to put that line through?
Well, in my opinion, I believe so. And this is not just the high-speed rail, but we've seen this, whether it be rail projects and bypasses or going through a certain city, whether it be Owatonna, Rochester. We saw it years ago with the DMU Railroad, which was an ongoing saga for 10 years, if not more. And so, I think anytime they're talking about rail and right-of-way and and where it's going to go, I think agriculture should always watch, because I think what people forget sometimes is, not only what right-of-ways and land and how that may impact agriculture if you're outside of a city, but also then, of course, what's on those rails and what that means for capacity. In a somewhat related note, we look at capacity when it comes to Keystone Pipeline and grain shipments and all the rail car issues we have had in the past at times, and so what's also the capacity and what's utilized for those rail lines. So I think it's twofold. To me, it's what's on the rails. Are they split? Can they be utilized? And also, are they looking at also having to do things which might impact producers and their opportunity to utilize their land and access to their property?
And we've been speaking with Dave Ladd, president of RDL and Associates, and he's an ag policy expert out of the Twin Cities, talking about issues that impacted farmers and producers in 2015 and looking forward to 2016. Thank you so much for your time today, Dave.
Thanks, and have a happy